You're listening to Bigfoot Society podcast, hosted by our captain, Jeremiah Byron, where it's all Bigfoot all the time. Have you ever had the urge to do more, to be more? Now you can by joining Bigfoot Society on the Patreon. Get ad-free episodes and even member-only episodes. Take part in movie night and even live video chats. Interact behind the scenes with Jeremiah and other Patreon members like me, Leia. The powerful podcast goes on, and you may contribute a verse in our Patreon community. Carpe diem. Seize the day, Bigfooters, and make your lives extraordinary.
Welcome to Bigfoot Society. If you have Bigfoot activity to report from the same areas discussed in this episode, please reach out to me directly after this episode. And if you'd like to be on the podcast to discuss a personal Bigfoot encounter, please reach out to me directly at bigfootsociety@gmail.com. Do you wish there was more Bigfoot Society to listen to every week? Well, there is now. If you become a supporting member over at Patreon, you get a special members-only episode every single week on Wednesdays, and sometimes even more episodes. Head on over to patreon.com/The Bigfoot Society. And now let's get on with the show. All right, Bigfoot Society, we've got the privilege of talking to Dave today. Dave's an individual from Southwest Pennsylvania who reached out to me through email to share what he has experienced over the years. A lot of interesting things that are going to be going on in this one, and I'll let him explain the exact region that we're talking about in Southwest Pennsylvania. But Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. I appreciate you having me on.
There's going to be a lot of really interesting things that are shared, but I'd say let's get right into it. Feel free to share anything about yourself that you might need the listeners to know, where you're at, and how you got involved with this whole wild Bigfoot thing to begin with.
Sounds good. I guess I'll start at the very beginning. I live just outside of Pittsburgh and Munhall. It's about 10 miles outside of Pittsburgh. And to be honest with you, I think that the very beginning was pretty much the day I was born, whether it be coincidence or whatnot. But I believe that the Patterson-Gimlin film is probably about the best evidence there is for Bigfoot. And I was born when the film was made, 10/20/67. And growing up, I know like a lot of viewers mentioned that I was always interested in the Bigfoot thing growing up in the 70s and I was always anxious to watch the In Search Of and the Bigfoot documentaries and before internet and all that. And the $6 Million Man movie or show that was on back in the 70s, like they had the Bigfoot episode with that. I've heard people mention that, and that was like my favorite six. I was just always seemed to be connected to it. So I was always interested in it, and I didn't have any experiences till I believe it was 1987. And for whatever reason, that year, there was a lot of sightings in the Pittsburgh area. And this is before the internet, the cell phones, and everything. And I remember that like the local news channels they had, and the newspapers there was a lot of reports. So they actually had articles, and they had like artist sketches of what people saw in the paper and things on the news about it. And there was just a lot of sightings. I believe it was 87. But in that year, I believe it was in the spring, so the snow was melting. And we had a cabin up on the Laurel Ridge. It runs parallel to Chestnut Ridge. It's a little southeast of Pittsburgh, about 50 miles away. And we had a cabin right next to my buddy's cabin. The cabins were situated on basically a hillside that went on a crest of a ridge and then went into a deep drainage behind that. So when you turned up the driveway, my buddy's cabin was on the left, and then our cabin was up a little bit and to the right, so cat-a-corner to it. And straight across from his cabin and down from our cabin was like a 1-acre stand of pretty thick pine trees. So that spring, like I said, I believe it was 87. And in that spring, when the snow was melting, there was patches of snow. The ground was soft. It was melt off. And the one weekend, there were footprints that came from behind our cabin, across the driveway, through the backyard of my buddy's place, and you saw footprints in the snow where there was patches of snow. Then where there wasn't snow, you can see the deep impressions in the soft ground of the footprints. The footprints went back behind his place, and they had an in-ground pool behind their cabin. And there was like a 4-foot cyclone chain link fence around the pool area. And you followed the footprints, and they were long strides, obviously. And then when you got to the corner of the pool area, so if you're looking at the pool, it was like the back right corner of the pool area, closest to the yard. The footprints went back, and then there was snow back there because at that time it was shaded. And there was a footprint outside the chain link fence. Then there was a footprint inside the chain link fence, inside the pool area, and a footprint back outside the chain link fence. So it's made one footstep inside the pool area, back in the back corner, but basically almost didn't break stride and walked right over the 4-foot fence like it wasn't even there. So that was our first kind of inclination that, hey, maybe Bigfoot is real. And that was in, I believe, like I said, March in the spring when the snow was melting off. And then, so later that year, I believe it was in June, me and my buddy, they had a pretty big driveway. So they had a basketball hoop in the driveway. So one night, I think it was June, we were out with my girlfriend at the time. There was me, my buddy, my girlfriend, and we're playing a game of horse, shooting basketball. And it was about 11 o'clock at night or so. And it was a really calm night, quiet. And we got this odor, this pungent odor. It's unforgettable. It's almost undescribable. But if I had to describe it, I would describe it as probably like 50% like rotting flesh, like a deer carcass rotting in the August heat, and maybe 40 like a garbage smell, just like a rotting garbage smell, maybe like a 10% like a skunky smell. And we smelled it, and and like I said, there was no wind, but it was coming from back behind us. So it was like the thermals was getting cooler at night, and you get a whiff of it now and then, and it was really pungent. It like coated the back of your throat. It was in your mouth, up your nose, like almost burned your nose. So if I came and went, then it went away. So we were shooting basketball for a little while longer, and it was a little later. So it was maybe midnight, 12:30, and we weren't even shooting basketball anymore. We're sitting on the wall, and we're just sitting there talking quietly, and we smelled the same smell again. And so we jokingly said, they say Bigfoot has a bad odor. Yeah, it's probably Bigfoot. And having seen them tracks a few months earlier, kind of thinking, maybe it's Bigfoot. So we're sitting there joking about it. But now the smell wasn't going away. This lasted maybe 15 minutes or so. And we're sitting there quietly, and we heard footsteps coming, and they came from back behind my cabin. And they went into that stand of pines that was across from where we were playing basketball and down from my cabin. It's like a 1-acre stand of pines. And you can hear and feel each footfall coming through those pines. And it's an older stand of pines, so there's probably a foot or two of pine quills laying on the ground. There's no leaves or anything. It's all pine quills. But you can feel and hear each footfall. And it was just like, boom, a steady gait right through those pines. And it went diagonally through the pines, came out the bottom of the driveway. You heard each footfall cross the driveway, then cross the road, and below the cabin was 3 small ponds. So it went into the center pond, and we heard splashing around and sloshing around in the lake. And we were, at this point, we're scared. We're standing by the corner of the door ready to run in the cabin, because you could feel the power in the footsteps, and you could feel it in your chest, the massiveness of this thing. And so we're standing by the door, and we're listening to this thing in the lake, and it's sloshing around. And didn't know what it was doing, but you can hear just splashing, sloshing, whatever it was doing in there. At that time, we thought it was, who knows, chasing fish, whatever. We didn't know what else it could be. It wasn't no bear. It was bipedal. It was 2 footsteps coming through those pines. And we listened to it for a while. I got a rock. I ran out into the driveway, and I threw a rock down over the hill towards the road. And the rock didn't make it to the lake, but it made it down by the road. And when the rock hit down near the road, it got dead quiet, and there was nothing. It was just silence. So we stood by the door of the cabin for a while, and then we waited, didn't hear nothing. So I went out and I threw another rock down there. When I threw the second rock, it tore out of there. It came out of the lake, and it basically took the exact same path that it took down to the lake. It ran across the road, but it wasn't walking. It was a much quicker pace. And it come up through the pines, back behind my cabin, and went into the drainage behind our cabin. And that was pretty much for that. But learning, I'm going to jump around a little bit because obviously with the internet, and I'll get into what happened to me recently over the past 3 years or so. And but just to jump around, not to forget this, and what I learn now and what I think now and don't understand is, so this thing came through that stand of pines, and it's a thick stand of pines. I'm 5'9", 200 pounds, and I couldn't walk with a steady gait through those pines without ducking and weaving between trees or branches or whatnot. And this thing came through there like it was walking across an open field. The trees weren't even there. And it was just a steady footprints, boom, coming through those pines. No tree breaks, no leaves. There was no leaves in there, but no branches breaking, just steady footsteps all the way through those pines. And I just, if this, didn't see it, but say it was 7-8 foot tall and 800 pounds, there's no way in the world this thing can walk through there at a steady gait without moving trees, breaking trees. So I didn't even really think about that until this year and how that could be. And so that was it for that. And then later that year in the fall, me and my buddy, we were out riding quads, and we were on this old railroad track, but it's a bike trail now. And we were actually out near where a lot of my current experiences are going on. And we were riding, and we were along a creek, and it was a thick part of the creek where there's a lot of mountain laurel and rhododendron down in the creek bottom. And it gets really thick down in there. And we were going down a quad path, and I was out front, and my buddy was behind me. And we just hit a patch where I smelled that exact same smell again that we smelled that night we were shooting basketball. And like I said, it's an unmistakable smell. It's a one-of-a-kind, unique smell. And so I just kept going. I went another couple miles, and I pulled over just to put some distance between us and the smell. And my buddy pulled over behind me, and he took his helmet off, and he came up to me. He said, "You smelled it, didn't you?" I was like, "Yeah." I said, "I did." And it's, like I said, it's a unique smell. And that was pretty much it for the 80s. And then I pretty much didn't have anything for 33 years or so until, today's Halloween, actually. So it was Halloween 2020, so 4 years ago. And so there's a 33-year gap there where I had some things happen looking back on it, maybe a couple times throughout the 33 years that maybe wasn't a bear, maybe it was something else. It's pretty much nothing. And then I'll get into the 2020 thing on Halloween that pretty much changed everything for me and my son, because my son was with me. So Halloween 2020, me and my son and I, we were up near Forbes State Forest down in southeast, a little south. It's probably 70 miles, I'd say, southeast of Pittsburgh or so. And we were down there hunting, and there's some game lands down that way. And we were hunting deer, and I think it was archery bear also in the morning. And then we hunted pheasant in the afternoon. Had nothing happen in the morning. Hunted pheasant in the afternoon, and we got, I think my son limited out. So he got 2 birds and I got 1. And so for the evening, we were going hunting, but in a different spot than we hunted. And we went in and we hunted. It was a beautiful day. It was actually warm for Halloween, but it was a calm, sunny day, not a cloud in the sky. And it was actually also the first time there was a full moon on Halloween in decades. I don't know the exact number, but it was a long time since there's been a full moon on Halloween. We went hunting and put my son, he was at the time 13, 14, something like that. I put him in a spot and near a capped off gas well where they capped it off, and they planted some grasses and clover, and the deer would come in there in the evening. So I put him there, and I wasn't far from him because he was still young, and I was maybe 300 yards past him up the ridge further. And so we hunted till dark, and we had radios. So my son came on the radio and said he had 3 doe in front of him in the field. So we gave it some time, but they weren't moving off. They were feeding. I told my son, and he was just sitting on a hillside, camouflaged and covered up with some mountain laurel, and didn't want him to give up his spot and show the deer where he was. So I told him just to sit tight, and I'll walk down the path. Let me spook the deer walking down the path. It's more natural, and so they don't, get educated as to where he was sitting. So I did that, walked down the path, spooked the deer. Sun come down to me, and we talked a little bit. And like I said, it was a beautiful, probably 45, 50 degree night, and the moon was just starting to come up, but the sun was down, so it was pretty much dark at this point. We had about a mile walk out of the woods. So we started walking out of the woods. It was dead quiet, and talking on the way out, and didn't even need flashlights because the moon was just coming up, but it was just lighting the tops of the treetops up. And it was huge. I think it was the harvest moon. Maybe it was the harvest moon. It's a big full moon. And we're working our way out. And so it probably took us a good 20 minutes or so to walk out. So it's well after dark when we get back to the truck. As we approached the truck, we were maybe 20 yards from the truck. And where the truck was parked, it's on a dirt road. And you can maybe fit 2 trucks where we were parked. And then in the bottom of the draw, there's a little bigger parking area. You probably fit maybe 5 or 6 trucks down there. And coming from that area in the bottom of the draw, as we approached the truck, there was a scream. And I've heard this said before, but that's what it sounds like. It sounds like a woman being murdered. Just this hellacious, blood-curdling scream. And it did it 3 or 4 times. And it just puts you into instant adrenaline mode. And my son, his name's Mark, so I'll just refer to him as Mark. He's Mark. And he said, "What was that?" And I was like, "I don't know." I says, "Maybe an owl," because you can tell it didn't seem like it was on the ground. It was elevated. And it wasn't that far away. It was maybe 80 yards away, I'd say. And so I did it 3 or 4 times. We were freaked out by that. And directly across from where the scream came from, I hear these big tree branches getting broken, and it sounded like a bulldozer starting to go through the woods. And at that time, this is an area where we bear hunt, and there was a big bear in the area. There was the game commission knew about it, and we actually talked to them. They said it had a collar on it, and they obviously weigh them and they check them and put collars on them, so they knew it was 600 plus pounds. So it was a pretty good sized bear, and we knew it was in the area. And I told my son Mark, I said, "I bet you that's that bear, and it's getting ready to cross the road." So I pulled my light out and I shined it down the road, and hoping to get a glimpse of it crossing the road. And then once I shined the light down the road where the stick breaks were coming from, it got real quiet. And then, I don't know, it was maybe a minute went by. And then slowly you can hear more sticks breaking in it. And it was working its way back down the valley. And we listened to it for a while. I turned the light off. And at this point, I'm not thinking, it's been 33 years since anything Bigfoot related happened to me. So at this point, I'm thinking that there was possibly an owl that screeched or screamed. I know I've heard owls and hawks, even crows, foxes, coyotes. I've heard a lot of strange stuff in the woods at night, but nothing quite like this woman screaming thing. And so that kind of threw me for a loop. And then as things working its way down the valley, it sounded like a bulldozer going down, just big trees being pushed over, big trees snapping. And I just couldn't explain what that was, and other than the bear. And it went down the valley a ways, and then it got quiet. We didn't really think too much other than that. And so I opened the tailgate of the truck, and we started taking our gear off and putting stuff away. And so we're throwing stuff in the back of the truck, and we're sitting there and we're talking a little bit, and maybe 10 minutes goes by. And we both had crossbows. So my son asked me, he says, can I discharge the crossbows? I was like, we have a discharge target to discharge them. And I said, sure, go ahead. So he put the target out. And like I said, the moon's coming up. It's almost like daylight. So I held the light on the discharge target so he can shoot the crossbow. And like I said, it was dead calm, no wind, just no cicadas, no nothing, no crickets, just dead calm, no noise to speak of at all. So he discharged the crossbow, and they make a pretty good noise when you discharge them, and it echoed. It almost sounded as quiet as it was. It sounded like a gun going off, and it echoed across the valley. And so he walks back over to the truck, and it wasn't 10 seconds later, and there was 3 knocks down in the valley where we heard all this stick breaking and trees breaking down towards where it was headed. And we heard 3 knocks. And at this point, never heard wooden knocks before. And I never even heard of these things other than the TV show. And, when the kids were little, they'd watch the TV show. And I know which one I'm talking about. I don't really care to promote their stuff because I don't agree with what they stand for. But so anyways, my son, he says, there was 3 of them. Was that wood knocks? I was like, I don't know. And so right after that, there's a creek that goes down there, and down where these noises came from, it's just like a shallow creek. And we heard a rock thrown in the creek, and you can hit almost like a river rock, a 5-pound river rock thrown up the creek. And you can hear a clack on the rocks and splash in the water, and then come the rest. And so now I'm thinking there's other hunters coming up the valley. They're down there screwing around, beating on trees or throwing rocks or whatever. So that's what I told him. Because like I said, that Bigfoot isn't even on my mind at this point. I thought I'd heard maybe an owl and a bear. And now we're hearing hunters coming up the valley. And so Bigfoot isn't even in my mind. And so we're getting things together, and he goes to discharge the other crossbow, and he shoots it. Same exact thing happens. There's 3 wood knocks, maybe a 10-second break, and then there's a rock thrown up the creek, same way. Then you can hear a rock clack hitting rocks in the creek, and the water splashing. Comes the rest. And so now I'm thinking, yeah, there's guys coming up the valley. So there's really not a lot of places to park around that area, and it's pretty remote. And so I walked out onto the road, and I looked down into that lower parking area, and there was no vehicles. There was no vehicles on the road. There's hardly any traffic on this road at all. And so there was nobody there. So that kind of made me think, who could this be? And then I'm thinking it's Halloween. Who knows? Maybe someone is coming up through there, and maybe, they're goofing off, screwing around. So we waited a while. And so where we were parked, the creek that the rocks were being thrown in, it actually goes under the road right near where we were parked. And when it crosses under the road, comes out the other side, if you go down there about 40, 50 yards, there's a beaver had that dammed up down there. And so the water was probably 4 feet deep right there, but then on the other side of the dam, it just turns into a babbling brook the rest of the way down. And so we're sitting there and putting the bows away, putting gear away and stuff. And we had them 3 pheasants from earlier in the day that we got, and we were debating on whether to clean them or take them back to the cabin and clean them. So we're sitting there, and then we hear this pretty close to us down in the creek right across the road from us where the beaver has it dammed up. We hear these, we didn't know what it was at the time. Like I said, we're not thinking nothing about Bigfoot yet. And we hear these kerplunks, they're coming towards us through the beaver where the beaver has it dammed up. And you hear plunk, kerplunk. And my son's, what's that noise? I was like, I don't know. And then you hear another one, kerplunk. And I just couldn't imagine what it could be. And it sounded like it was getting closer. So anything I could possibly remotely think was there's a gas line right up the road. And when I first started hunting back in probably 80, I don't even know, 84, 85, first places I hunted with my buddy, he had a camp up Allegheny National Forest up in northwestern PA. And we hunted up there, and there was beaver ponds up there and gas lines run all over the place up there. And a lot of the gas lines up there have holes in them, and they bubble up through the beaver ponds, and there's this big elephant grass everywhere. And so the only thing I could tell my son was them kerplunks were like maybe gas leaking out of a gas line and maybe elephant grass over the water, over the line, and building up a little air bubble and, going kerplunk. And that's the only thing I come up with, but I knew there was no gas line there. The gas line's up the road more, and I know where it runs, and it doesn't run through that creek. So that's all I could tell him. So we're sitting on a tailgated truck, and we're debating on cleaning these birds there or not. And then we heard a splash. It was pretty loud, but I wrote it off as a beaver tail splash because there's a beaver there. There's a beaver pond there. It didn't quite sound like a beaver tail splash. I mean, I've heard them. I've been in kayaks close to their huts, kayaking, fishing in different lakes, and have them splash real close to me, and it didn't really sound like a beaver tail slap. But I wrote it off. Like I said, I'm still not thinking Bigfoot about any of this stuff. So we're debating on the birds, cleaning the birds, sitting on a tailgate, talking a little bit. The moon's coming up. It's really getting pretty bright out. And a truck comes down the road. He goes down to that lower parking area, backs in, sits there a minute, turns around, and goes back up past us. And we're well after dark. It's at least an hour after dark, if not more. And I thought he was turning around to see if maybe we got a deer or if we needed help getting something out. But he came back up past us and just kept going. And he went up around the bend. And as soon as he went around the bend, there was a rock thrown in that beaver pond not far from us, maybe 35 yards from us. And there's thick hemlocks in there, and it's real thick, like almost like scrub oak down in there. It's just a tangled mess of scrub oak and hemlocks. And so we couldn't see, you can't see much past the other side of the road. But this thing threw a boulder in there, and we were both in the air, off the tailgate, and in the truck simultaneously. We didn't say anything. It was just instant. You felt a concussion in your chest. It was big. It was like a 200-pound sack of cement was thrown in there. And you heard the boulder hit the bottom of the water as a creek and hit other rocks. It was big. So we get in the truck, and I didn't even say anything to my son. He's freaked out. I'm freaked out. And we close the doors. He says, "You know what that is, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." "Yeah, there's nothing else really to explain off here." And so I start the truck up, and we're getting ready to tear out of there. And I stopped right before we pulled onto the road. And I told my son, and he's freaked out, and he's like hyperventilating, and I'm freaked out. And I had my experiences in the 80s, and I told him that, and I says, "This is," and they, like I said, they watched the TV show, and everybody's armchair quarterback when you're sitting at home watching TV. But when you're in the woods and this actually happens to you, and everybody says, "Oh, I'd go throw a rope around his neck and drag him to town," that ain't what it is. When this thing actually happens to you, it's life-changing, and it'll scare the hell out of you. And so I left it up to him, and I said, "This is up to you. If you want to stay here and see what happens, or you want to go home, we'll go home." He says, "All right, let's stay." So I didn't stay in that spot because, like I said, we were really close to where this thing just threw that boulder. So we went down the road, and I backed into where that bigger parking area is, about 100 yards away or so. And just to give myself some more distance. And I backed in there, shut the truck off, put the window halfway down. And I had a 44 mag next to me, and I was still scared. I just felt it wasn't going to do anything anyways. So we sat there for probably a half hour, and it was dead quiet. Not a peep, no crickets, nothing. Dead silence. And like I said, it's probably at least 2 hours after dark now. And we sat there for a half hour, nothing happened. And I had my phone sitting on a door panel trying to record in case something would happen, so I can try to record something. And nothing happened. So my wife calls me and she asked me, like, where are we at? And I'm like, and I started telling her what was going on, and she's telling us we're crazy, come home, get something to eat, blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, this is no joke. This is really happening. And so we're talking to her, and a car comes past and went the same direction as the truck did maybe an hour earlier. It was the last vehicle that went down the road was that truck. And then this car comes past. I'm talking to my wife on the phone. And as the car goes up around the bend, and mind you, we're further away than we were before, this thing threw another boulder in that dammed up part of the creek. And same thing, we were in the truck and you felt a concussion in your chest, and it displaced the water, and it scared us. And we were sitting in the truck, and first thing that popped into my head is this thing's throwing boulders, 200-pound boulders. It gets pissed off enough. I don't want it coming down to the truck and throwing a boulder through the windshield and killing me, my son, both of us. So now I was scared for our safety. So I took off, and I didn't go back past where the boulders were being thrown. I went the other way. So I drove out to the T on the road, which is about, I don't know, maybe a mile and a half or so. And we sat there, and we were pretty shook up. And we sat up there for, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes or so. And we calmed down. And we were actually going to leave from there because I didn't want to get hurt, didn't want my son to get hurt and whatnot. But we decided to go back past through and just drive through and shine a light down where the creek goes, where it was dammed up, and just see if we see something. But we were gone for probably 15, 20 minutes. So we come back down, and I wasn't stopping, but just creeped through there, and my son shined the light down the creek and didn't see nothing. And so we just kept going, went up around the bend, and there's a small lake there, and come around, it makes an S bend. So we come around the other part of the S bend, and I didn't count the deer. There had to be at least 6 to 8 does that were freaked out. I've never seen deer act like this. I've been hunting my whole life for 40 years. And I bet they were like, if you watched a litter of kittens playing with a ball of yarn, how they jump on top of each other and they're skittish and they turn their head real quick and they dart from one spot to another. That's what they were doing. And these deer were freaked out. And I was blown away by that. So we went past the deer and we turned around, came back again. And there was one, when we turned around and came back, and we were only going a minute, all the deer were gone except one. And it was standing in the middle of the road, and it was looking away from us down towards we were just having this encounter in the thick stand of hemlocks. And it was just staring and stomping its hoof, staring in those hemlocks. And I crept up on the deer in my truck in the middle of the road, and it didn't even pay us no mind. It just was staring in them hemlocks, stomping its foot. So eventually it looked at us, and it looked back and forth a couple times, and then it bolted into the woods. So we went back down there and turned around, came back up, and we sat up higher where the deer were. And we sat there for probably another 45 minutes or so, and it was quiet, and it was over. But my feeling is that when we approached the truck and that thing screamed 3 or 4 times, I think just by random, we approached the truck the same time these beings were trying to cross the road. And I think 1 or 2 of them were on our side of the road, and the rest of them were on the lower side of the road. And we cut them in half. And I think that's why they were so aggressive and why they did what they did, because they were separated. But that's just the feeling I got. And so after that happened, I called my buddy, because I remember, I think it was maybe a year before that, we were bear hunting, and we were in one convenience store, and they had a piece of paper on there with a phone number, and you pulled a phone number off, and it said something about if you see paranormal or aliens, UFOs, Bigfoot, whatever, call this number. So I knew my buddy took a picture of it on his phone. So I called him, and I got the number, and I called because obviously this is a really hot, fresh encounter. And I'd figure with everything that was going on that night, the next morning, there should be fresh footprints, tree breaks, the whole 9 yards. So I called the number and left a message, and unfortunately, nobody responded to me for 2 weeks. And so me and my son, we came home after that. We didn't go back to the cabin. I have it's a one-room cabin it's 18 miles from where this experience happened. And so we didn't go back to the cabin. We came home. And so we debated it during the night, and we said, you know what? There was a cold front. Like I said, it was a beautiful day that day. The next day around noon, there was a cold front coming through, and the temperature was dropping, and it was actually supposed to start snowing up in the mountains. And so I says, you know what, let's get up early tomorrow morning. We'll go up there in the daylight and just poke around a little bit, see if we see anything. So we did that. We went up there, and we went to where the boulders were being thrown in the creek, figuring, in my mind, there has to be a big dirt socket somewhere on the ground where this thing picked up a boulder and slammed it into the dammed up part of the creek. And so we go in there, and it's, like I said, there's hemlocks there, and they're covered, a lot of boulders, a lot of the logs and everything are covered in moss. So it would stick out like a sore thumb if something picked up a 100-pound boulder and threw it into that creek. And we looked, and we couldn't find anything. We found one small branch broken, and we found one footprint, which I took pictures of this stuff. And it's not a footprint in the mud or anything, but you can see it plain as day. It's harder on the camera, on the phone, but it's an impression in the leaves because all the leaves were fluffed up. This is end October. All the leaves just fell. And it was you can see it plain as day. It stuck out like a sore thumb, but it was only one print, which was odd. And I was like, how do you have just one footprint? And so we took a picture of that, and we're going up and down the creek, and from the beaver dam all the way up to the road, both sides, and we can't find anywhere where this thing pulled 3 boulders out of the ground and slammed it into the creek. And so then it hit me. It didn't pull the boulder off of the land, off of the dry ground. When we heard those kerplunks coming up through the creek, it was in the creek. So we heard kerplunk. It was walking in the 4-foot part of the creek. So it didn't have to grab a boulder from the ground. It probably just bent over, grabbed the boulder out of the bottom of the creek, picked it up, and slammed it back down. That's why we didn't find any muddy dirt sockets of where there's a boulder missing. And that kind of solidified what the kerplunking noises were. And so we went back up, and I had a tape measure in my truck, and I measured the footprint, and it was roughly 18 inches long and 10 inches wide. And so we measured as far out as I can reach without going in. It was 3.5 feet deep, where as far as I could reach with the tape measure, see how deep it was out there, or the creek dammed up. And that's waist deep on a normal human being. So for these footfalls to come straight down on top of the water and make that kerplunking noise, there was no wading, there was no splashing. It was just kerplunk, like these footfalls were coming straight down from the top into the water. And this thing had to be enormous to have footfalls come down into the water like that. And so 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the phone number, and I gave them a brief description of what happened. And then they referred me to a guy in West Virginia, and I called him, and we talked. And I was telling him my story. And so this kind of goes into Big Brother is always listening. He's listening now. And I called him, and I was 3/4 of the way through telling him our experience, and we got disconnected. And when I say disconnected, it wasn't a drop call. It wasn't nothing like that. There was a pop in the phone. If you had an electric guitar and an amp hooked up to it, and you had it on full power, and you yank the cord out of the amp, and it makes that loud electronic pop. That's what it was. I actually jerked the phone away from my ear. That's how loud it was. So I'm sitting there, and I was like, wow, I can't believe that just happened. And then the guy from West Virginia, he calls me back on a different line. And he's like, yeah, that happens all the time. And that's what he said. He says, that's Big Brother. He watches me all the time. If I don't like what they're hearing, they disconnect me. And I was like, really? And he's like, okay. And so I finished telling him my experience. And so he asked me at the end of talking to him, what do you think Bigfoot is? And I at that point, I knew of two two camps. There's the Pithecus, the missing link, the ape thing, that belief, and then there's the other side that's aliens, spiritual, interdimensional, which I was in the physical part, the missing link thing, but I couldn't comprehend the other part of it. And so I was in the physical part, the missing link, physical, Gigantopithecus, just eluding everybody. And so that's where I was at that point. But that really, so after that experience, that really, it was life changing for me and my son. And so that started my search on the internet for different things. And to be honest with you, most of the stuff on our internet is BS and clickbait. And so I settled on a few different channels, and they were all pretty much like yours, that has viewers tell their experiences. And I think that's the most credible ones. And so I started listening to those. And one of the first ones I got to was Steve's channel, How to Hunt. And I really listened to that a lot because he just rereads pretty much the emails that come into him about different experiences. And it seems like a no BS kind of guy. And so I listened a lot to him. And so I'm not a computer. I'm not a internet guy. I'm not a computer guy. I dread it, to be honest with you. I'm old school. And so I listened to Steve's channel for, I'd say a few months. And I never described any or subscribed to anything before. And I decided to subscribe to his channel because it just makes it easier. When new content comes out, it automatically pops up. And this is the first time I ever subscribed to anything. I never even watched YouTube or anything before this. And I subscribed to his channel, and it was later. It was like 10:30 at night or so. And every morning when I got up, I had a routine where I would search kind of same things on Google. And at the time I was looking for some property, and I was searching some things. Like every morning I'd search the same thing, like things for sale and stuff. So I subscribed to his channel like 10:30 at night. The next morning I got up, and how Google tracks you. And as soon as you go onto Google, all your recent search stuff comes up. And when I pulled Google up, my entire search history was cleared off my phone. There was nothing. It was blank. And then, so I went to Steve's channel, and I was unsubscribed from his channel. And this was only 12 hours, if that I just subscribed to his channel. And then my whole Google search history was erased. So I thought that was really strange. And that was that. And so that was 2020. And then the rest of that year, so that was in October, Halloween. And the rest of that year had no other experiences. 2021 had nothing to speak of. Hunted a lot, same area, nothing. There was absolutely nothing until 2022. So, like I said, we do a lot of hunting in this area. We hunt deer, bear, pheasants, grouse. That's like our main hunting area. And so 2022, I was a mechanic for 30 plus years, and I retired from doing that in 2020. And so I took a year off, and I started delivering motorsports pretty much around the country. And so I was coming back from a run. This was September of 2022. And I was coming back from Virginia, and I was coming back generally in the area of where we hunt. So I just wanted to swing by and see if we have permission to hunt one of the farms there that's adjacent to the game lands and the state forest. So I just want to see what crops, because they usually alternate beans and corn every year. And when they have corn, we do pretty good bear hunting, and we have beans, it's not so good. So it was mid-September. I was coming back from a run, and I swung by just to see what the farms had as far as what they planted. And so I pulled into that lower parking area, and I had to take a leak. And so I just jumped out of the truck, and I just walked about 10 yards in the woods, and I'm taking a leak, and it was bigger than a tree branch. It was a log, and it was thrown. If I'm looking into the woods, it came from my 11 o'clock across in front of me, ticking branches. I got glimpses of it. It wasn't right in front of me. It was maybe 15 yards in front of me. And it came from like my 11 o'clock diagonally across in front of me and landed at like my 4 o'clock and tumbled and rolled through the leaves. And it wasn't a tree branch that broke off and fell down through the trees. This was a log. This was a 10-inch in diameter log that was thrown through the trees. And that freaked me out. So I turned around, jumped back in the truck, and took off. And mind you, there was nothing happened for the past almost 2 full years. But I knew what that was. And that from that point on, it's been pretty much almost, so in 2022, I'd say probably 60% of the time we went up there, something happened. And 2023, probably 80% of the time I go up there, something happens. And so this year, almost every time I go up there, something happens. And so in 2022, after the log in September, we started hunting in October. Back one of our main hunting spots, we're walking this path back there. And obviously I've been doing a lot of research on trying to gain knowledge on the internet. And there's this giant X structure walking back to, I call it ground zero, is where like all this stuff, a lot of it originates from, or happens, or the howls, all these vocalizations come from. They start like in the same area. So I call it ground zero. And there's this giant X structure. So I thought that was weird. And I actually took a couple pictures of it. And this is the first time I've been in the woods in this area that hunting season of 23 or 22. And so I took a couple pictures of it. And as I'm walking past the X structure, and I get maybe 50 yards past it, and the X structure is maybe 80 yards off of the path in the woods. There's one, as I walk past it, there was one loud wood knock came from behind me where I just walked from, on the same side of the path as the X structure. So that kind of freaked me out, but I was like, okay. So I just kept walking, went hunting, did my thing, came back out. And so that was that. And I'm not going to get into every fake owl hoot and holler and different things, but just almost, it just seems like most of my encounters were, I go hunting all day, and then a lot of times I come out in the dark. So right at dark or right after dark on the way out. A lot of times it was right when I got back to the truck. There'll be a series of owl hoots, they might start out as owl hoots, but they end up as more like vocalizations, and almost just to let me know they're there. They're not aggressive, no screaming or nothing like that. But so then we got into October of 22, and one of the guys we hunt with, he was born up in this area of the mountains, and he had a encounter in 2017 where him and one of his friends were trout fishing in a creek not far from where we were, and it's a gorge, it's pretty steep hillsides, and he had an encounter where they felt like they were being watched, and they saw one up on the hillside, and it kept hiding behind trees, and it ran off, and they saw it run off. And so he's the only other one, other than my buddy that we were shooting basketball with in the 80s, that had experiences. And so we were going deer hunting. We had muzzle loaders for deer and bear in October of 22. And so me, my son, Mark, and my buddy were walking down this long path, a pretty good hike down into where we were going to hunt. And we were talking on the way in, and I was like, man, wouldn't it be weird if all three of us had experiences? Wouldn't it be weird if we go down in here and something happens? And we're joking about it. And we go down there, and I drop my buddy off first, and then me and him were looking over the same drainage. And I was on a power line. He was to the right of me in some thick stuff. And my son was past me on the other end of this field, looking in the same where the two drainages come together. And as soon as I got to my spot and settled down, and I was looking over a power line, and I could see about probably 150 yards. It went in the drainage and up the other side. And to the left of me, I can hear something. It sounded like I thought it was a bear. It sounded like it was a bear ripping a log apart for grubs and insects. And you could hear like grunting noises, and I really thought it was a bear. So I listened to it for a while, but I couldn't see it, and it was working its way away from me. I'm listening to it, and I didn't really hear. I just hear the leaves crunching. Couldn't say one way or another if it was 2 feet, 4 feet, but I thought it was a bear. And then, so the sun went down, and directly across from me, to the left, on the same side where the noises were coming from, directly across from me on the other side of the power line, on the other side of the canyon, there was one super loud wood knock, like 2 Louisville sluggers, and unmistakable, just one loud crack wood knock. And that kind of freaked me out. So, and then I started thinking about maybe this wasn't a bear, and it's getting darker. And then in the bottom of the drainage from my right, so it would have been coming from my buddy's position, I hear voices, and they were getting louder and closer, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like if there was 3 or 4 people talking 100 yards away from you, and you can hear language and words, but you couldn't discern what they were talking about. And it was getting louder, and it came out almost to the power line, and it was about dark, and they just hung up there, and I could just hear this mumbling in indiscernible language, just voices and mumbling. And it sounded like 3 or 4 different voices. But it never came out on the power line. It got dark. So I headed out and met up with my buddy, and I asked him if he heard voices down and below him. He's like, yeah. He said, I don't know what that was. And he said they came past him. And then we met up with my son. He heard the same thing. So obviously with the wood knock, and that was the first time I heard any kind of vocalizations like that, where it was like a language. And so that kind of freaked us out, and we left. And let's see, so that was in October, I think, of 22. And let's see, so there was, then I don't want to get into every encounter, but so then that kind of fast forwards me to December of that year. And we were in there. It was like one of the last, actually it was January. So, cause it was like one of the last days of flintlock season, and there was snow on the ground. And me and my son, we were in there hunting, and I did a little push for him, and I was coming out at the end of the day, and it was about dark. And you can tell when these things are around, and there's a pressure in the air. It's hard to describe. But it's honestly, the best way I could describe it is if you were out to a nice restaurant and you got silverware clinking and glasses clanking and people talking, and it's normal, and then a guy stood up in the restaurant and screamed at somebody and freaked out and yelled at somebody, his wife, whoever, got into an argument with somebody, and then sat down, and how it would just be dead quiet in there. And there would just be a pressure in the air, like of anxiety, because this guy just yelled. And, that's the only way I could really describe it, is there's a pressure in the air, and it's just dead quiet. And I'm walking out of the woods, and it was about dark. And I just got out to this path, and I walked past this point. And as soon as I got past this point, literally maybe 10, 20 yards off to my right, just inside the woods line, something took me. It was multiple ones of them, and just breaking branches, breaking trees. It started right next to me and went away from me. And it just, I've been hunting all my life. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It was something large. And it was like the Halloween night thing, just pushing trees over, big trees breaking. And that kind of freaked me out. And so that was one of the last things that happened in 2022. And we go to last year, and it started normal upper archery season, hoots, haulers. And so we get to October. It was actually a year ago today. It was on Halloween. I don't know, for some reason, a lot of things happened to me on Halloween. And so a year ago today, I was up there, and we were archery hunting for bear, and hunted the morning, uneventful. And in the evening, my son and I were hunting. He was in a cut. There's these thickets that roll over this hill. So he was in the first cut of hardwoods, and there's a thicket between us, and I was in the second cut of hardwoods. And I saw 2 bears They came up to cut straight to me, and I ended up getting the one. And so I got one in archery season. Well, it only went about 40 yards and laid over and died. And I just knew. My son came over to me. We field dressed the bear, and I just knew. I could just feel the pressure. I just knew they were there. I knew they were watching us. And so I called a couple of my buddies to come help us get the bear out, because it's a pretty good hike back in there. We field dressed the bear. I laid it out and to cool. And me and my son, we walked back to the truck. We get back to the truck, and my son had to answer a couple emails to a coach, for a baseball coach. So he jumped in the truck, and I was putting stuff in the bed of the truck and pulling a sled out, because out here we haul our deer and bear in a jet sled, and it works out pretty well. It's a lot better than a cart. And so I'm getting the jet sled out, and we're waiting for my other two buddies to show up to give us a hand. And so there's a gas well field close to where we park. And I'm standing there, and there was 3 of them in this gas well field in the middle of the field. I didn't see them. It was too dark. And so from like right to left, the first one hooted. The second one whistled. And then the third one. So when we bear hunt in Pennsylvania, you're not allowed to use dogs, bait, anything. You basically have to put drives on and drive the bears out of thickets. You're not allowed to use any kind of devices, anything. So we have a group of 20 guys when we bear hunt. So you push 10 and post 10 and try to drive the bears out of thickets. And so everybody, they have their own thing. Some guys whistle, some guys say, "Hey, bear." Some guys, they do their own thing. So when I go through the thickets, I go, "Woo, woo," like that. And so I'm sitting there, and I hear these 3 things in the gas well field. The first one, he whistled. The middle one hooted, and then the end one went, "Woo, woo," like what I do when I'm bear hunting. And he was like mimicking what I do when we're bear hunting. And I thought that was pretty crazy. Obviously, so now I'm pretty, freaked out, because we have to go back in the woods and get my bear. I know they're there now for sure. So it was only 5 minutes after that, and that's all they did was them 3 vocalizations. And my 2 buddies show up, and so now there's 4 of us. And I told them what just happened in the gas well field. And, I was half thinking when we got back to the bear, it wasn't even going to be there. But so we went in there and got back to the bear, and it was there. It wasn't touched. And threw it in a sled, drug it out, and nothing else happened the whole way out. And it was all good. Fast forward to January of last year is another highlight. It was, again, one of the last days of flintlock season. And we were hunting in a spot where the deer yard up. And it's closer to my cabin, actually. It's only maybe 5 miles from my cabin. So it's about 15 miles, maybe 14, 13 miles from where most of this stuff has been happening. And so this is the first time they followed us somewhere else other than that valley and showed up somewhere else. And I'll tell you when it was last year in January. So I guess it would have been this January. Yeah, it would have been January 24. The Steelers were in the playoffs. So it was the day of the Steelers playoff game. And me and my son were up there hunting, and we hunt a spot, and we got it figured out pretty good. And it's where all the deer yard up, and there could be 40 deer down in there. And we know how to send somebody in one spot and where they run to. So we send one guy to where they run to, and one guy goes in, and it's like a 2-man push. We know where they go. And so my son went out to where they run, and as he's walking out there, he came on the radio, and he says, "Did you hear those wood knocks?" I'm like, "No." And I didn't. And then he said he heard the fake owl hoots. I'm like, "Well, I guess they're in here, but just keep heading out there." And so the deer, we bumped the deer, and they run to where we thought they would. And I missed a couple. And my son, he shot one. He shot a doe. And this was probably 10 o'clock in the morning or so. And so I go up to him and we start field dressing the deer, and he shot it right through the heart. And we usually keep the heart and eat it. And he shot it right through the heart, so we weren't keeping it. And I said, you know what? I said, they're here. I says, put the heart up on that log. And it was a horizontal log. It was deadfall. And we set it up on that log, and there was probably almost about a foot of snow. So there was maybe 8-10 inches of powder, then an inch of crust where each footfall, you took a step and you hovered there for a second, then you broke through the crust. And then there was maybe 2 inches of fresh snow on top of that. So we processed the deer, and we called his buddy, and he was on his way up to hunt the afternoon, and had him grab the jet sled and meet us halfway back, dragging the deer up. So we processed the deer, put the heart up on the log, and left the liver and all the internal organs there. And again, there was fresh 2 inches of powder on top of the 1 inch crusty ice. And the only footprints there was our footprints, obviously, and then the deer prints. And so we start dragging the deer out. We meet up with his buddy, drag it back to the truck. And my plan was to leave about 2 o'clock and go home and watch the Steeler game. His buddy comes, we get the jet sled, we throw it in, drag it back to the truck. And we're standing at the truck at the parking lot, and up the hill in the hemlocks starts the fake owl hoots. Like, I mean, they're vocalizations. I say they're owl hoots, but they're not even owl hoots. They're vocalizations. And so I was like, I'm leaving to go watch this. I didn't think my son and his buddy would stay there, but they did. And I said, you guys, yeah, we're going in there. I was like, okay. I said, if you want to, go ahead. I said, make sure you call me as soon as you get out of the woods. It gets dark. And so I left, and I just felt uneasy leaving, because they were there. And I don't think nothing's going to happen. I don't think they mean us no harm, but you just don't never know. And so they went in the woods, and I drove off. And I tried to call them, but they had no service because of where they are. And so I ended up coming home. And so it was pretty well after dark, and I'm waiting for my son to call. And I guess it took him a while because they had no service down where they were. And he calls me back on our way home, and he says, you ain't going to believe what happened. I was like, what happened? He says they got into deer again, and the deer ran to where the same spot where they always do, and they ran to where he shot the deer earlier in the morning. And he says they chased the deer in there, they didn't get one, and he was trying to get one for his buddy. And so they ended up going past where he processed the deer he got in the morning and put the heart on the log. And he says the heart was gone. He says the heart and the liver were both gone. He says there was no coyote tracks. There was no bird tracks. There wasn't, the liver was still attached to the gut pile. And there was no bird tracks, no coyote tracks, no other human tracks, nothing. Just, it was gone. And the liver, like I said, liver was attached. So it wasn't like a bird came down and pecked at it. There was no specks it was nothing like that. It just disappeared with no tracks. And so they were heading out. It was getting dark. And he said they were probably about 300 yards from the truck. And he heard a loud scream / yell come down near the creek below them. So they picked the pace up. And as they approached the truck, it did it again right behind the truck in a thick stand of hemlocks. And so that was pretty much it. Except, I got one more. So I never searched these things out. So after that happened, we were up there late season pheasant hunting. And so right at dark coming out, I had a fake owl hoot. And this thing, it was a long vocalization. And it started out like a hoot and then almost laughter at the end, like it was laughing. And so this was the first time I decided to not necessarily search them out, but make myself available after dark, not really in a hunting situation. So after that, I drove to where most of this stuff happens. It's about 3 miles up the road. And I back in there and I park. And I wasn't, making any noises, hooping, hollering, nothing. I just was sitting in my truck with the window down, close to where I call this ground zero. And I sat there for a while, and I just figured I'd sit there for a half hour and see if anything happens. And sure enough, I was there maybe 15 minutes, and I heard it was my call, my off in the distance. So that kind of makes your hair stand on end. And I'm sitting there, and a couple minutes later, and it did it again, but it was only maybe, I don't know, 40 yards in the woods right outside my driver's door. And I'm freaked out, and I'm listening, and I can hear down in the valley, it almost sounded like one of our drives, and it sounded like different vocalizations and hollers and coming, and it was going away from me. It wasn't loud enough to catch on like an audio recording, but you can hear it down in the valley. And it was going away from me, and it got quieter until but it was just like somebody doing a drive. And so I'm sitting there, and I was freaked out by it, and I didn't hear anything else close to me. The two vocalizations I heard close, and it was quiet. And then out of nowhere, probably 10 yards off my left front fender, I hear 3 heavy footfalls, the least crunch, and sticks breaking under the foot. And this thing, obviously, it didn't approach. I would have heard it coming from a ways off. It was dead quiet. It was a cloudy night, so it wasn't like a starlit night or a moonlit night. It was dark. And so that kind of freaked me out for this thing to take 3 steps that close to my truck. And like I've been struggling with actually coming face to face with one of these things and seeing something I can't unsee, and struggling with, do I want to see it? Do I not want to see it? And so this thing was right outside my door, and I had a flashlight in my lap, and I just couldn't bring myself to shine the light. I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. So because it freaked me out, I put my window up 3/4 of the way, started the truck up, and I thought that maybe where my headlights were pointing, it was off to the left a little bit. I thought maybe the residual light would light it up enough, but I didn't see anything. So I sat there for a minute, and I decided I'm just struggling with seeing one or not seeing one. So I shut my truck back off, put my window back down, and sat there another 5 minutes or so. And then there was footsteps right at the back of my truck, where my driver's tail light would be. And that freaked me out, because that was even closer than, it was right outside my door. So I started my truck up, and I have a 23 F350. So most newer vehicles, this is one of the freaky things here. Most newer vehicles, I'm not talking about your reverse sensors in your bumper. I'm talking about your blind spot warning light that comes on in your mirror, the little orange light that lights up, that shows somebody's in your blind spot if somebody's passing you or you're passing somebody on the highway. And when you start your vehicle up, both lights turn on, they prove out, they go, and then they prove out for maybe a second or two, and then they both go off. And I wasn't paying no mind to that, but that's just how it works. And so when this thing, I heard these footsteps right behind the quarter panel off the left tail light of my truck. I started my truck up, put my window up, and both lights proved out, and they both went off. And I'm sitting there, and I threw it in reverse, and I was getting ready to leave. And I'm looking in the tail light glow of my truck, the tail lights, and I don't see anything. And as I'm looking at my mirror, that blind spot, that orange light comes on. And I look over at the passenger mirror, and that one's not on. And I look at the driver's mirror again, and that light's glowing. So that freaked me out. So that told me something is right there within 10 feet of my truck. And I'm looking, like I said, it was a dark night. It was cloudy, no stars, no moon. But with the glow of the tail light, I couldn't see anything. It had to be right there. And a human being can't turn that blind spot mirror on, or the blind spot light on. It has to be something with, I don't know what these things are, but there's some kind of energy or a mass to them, or what. I mean, I know they manipulate with electronics. They've manipulated my phone, killed my phone, batteries, all that stuff. But whatever they did, whether it was their physical being, the mass of them, the energy, whatever, they turned that light on. They were standing right next to my truck. So that kind of freaked me out. I put it in reverse. I backed onto the gravel road and started down the road, and that light didn't go out for probably 100 feet down the road. And I went home because I was freaked out. Because to be that, I want to see one, but I'd like to see one from 200 yards away first. And so that was the first time like I said, I'm not a researcher. I don't go in the woods looking for these things, but that was the first time I made myself available after hunting hours and just to see what would happen. And that was at the end of last year. Or no, that was beginning of this year. So that was like in January of 24. That was pretty much it. And then nothing happened. I don't really go up there in the summertime too much, especially in the evening. There's, other than spring turkey, we had a couple things happen in spring turkey, the owl hoots and stuff. We were up there a couple times in May, but pretty much wasn't up there all summer, except for a couple times I was coming back from runs from Virginia, and I stopped and just parked where a lot of this stuff happens. And I think just about every time I stopped, something happened. But all vocalizations, no eye sightings or nothing. And the last time, so I really made my mind up, I want to see one. And it seems like it's almost, I don't want to say we're friends. It's not an aggressive encounters. They let me know they're there and they know I'm here, and they like dance around me pretty much. And so I made up my mind, I want to see one. And I was sitting on the tailgate of my truck. And a lot of times I do have a sidearm with me or my phone or whatever. So this was about a month ago. And I left everything in the truck, and I was sitting on the tailgate of my truck. And they were around me, and they came and went in close, further away. This went on for probably an hour and a half, 2 hours, where the owl hooting, the hollers, imitating my hollers. And they'd come and go. And they came in really close at about 10 o'clock at night. And they were coming in close. They were just out of sight. And they were all doing the owl hoots. And there was at least at least 4, maybe 5 of them. I think 4. And there was one down in the hemlocks down to the left of me, down in the bottom. And it was further away. And they were all doing the owl hoots and whatnot and imitating me. And so it was all good. And then the one down in the hemlocks in the bottom, it didn't do the bloody, woman scream. It did almost like a pterodactyl scream. But it was a high pitched voice, like it was a young one. Like, I don't know how to describe it. There's different tones to all these things. It's hard to explain unless you hear all these things. But it definitely sounded like a juvenile, like a higher pitched voice. So that kind of freaked me out, and because it was a scream, and it did it, and then it did it like 30 seconds later, and it was like, instead of being, say, 200 yards away, it was like 50 yards away, and it did it again. And then after it did it that second time, it got dead quiet. There was no more vocalizations whatsoever, and that was it. And nothing else happened that night. And the feeling I got was, it was like a really young one, and it was trying to scare me to show what it can do. And I know this stuff sounds crazy. And if I would hear somebody giving this interview 5 years ago, I'd say you're nuts. But believe me, there's different levels to this. And I think personally, everybody kind of starts at the same level. If you have a road crossing visual or a 1 encounter or 2 encounters, I was in it's a missing link thing forever. But the more encounters you have, the more questions, the more firsthand encounters you have, and realize that these things they have special powers that we don't understand, and they can do things that we don't understand. And the more you get into it, and the more encounters you have, that solidifies it for you, where it's not just a physical being, be it spiritual, interdimensional, whatever they are. I don't know, but they have powers that we can't understand. And they can do things we don't understand. They can leave footprints where and when they want. They can make footfalls where and when they want. I've listened to these things. I know. And that was about a month ago this year. And so my dog wasn't doing good, and she was on her last leg. And we were getting ready to go to Colorado elk hunting. And so the one property we have up the mountains there, I have an old backhoe. And I use it maybe once a year. And every time I use this thing, it blows a hydraulic line because it just sits all the time. So my dog was really doing bad. She couldn't get up. She couldn't go outside. I thought it was within a day or two we actually called the vet and saw about having to put her down. And so I went up there, and I wanted to take care of the whole before something to happen to her, because I didn't want to blow a hydraulic line and take 2 days to fix the thing and the whole 9 yards. So I go up there and I get the backhoe running and I'm digging a hole. Sure enough, I get 80% done digging the hole and blows a line. I go into town, get a line made, come back, and I finish right at dark. And so I shut the backhoe down, close it up, and I walk around the front of the backhoe, which is right at my cabin, and I hear voices down in the woods, and it's nothing but woods behind the cabin. It goes forever. And I hear voices coming towards me, and it's the mumbling, it's the indiscernible language. And I'm sad. I'm digging a grave for my dog, and I hear these voices coming towards me, and it's just like that, that one day we were hunting with my buddy, and we heard that undiscernible language, the mumbling, and the conversation. And they came within probably 40 yards of me or so, 50 yards, and they hung up there, and they were just sitting there like doing their language, talking. And I'm freaked out. It's dark. And so I was staying up there that night at the cabin. I sat by the fire till about 11 o'clock at night, and they were pretty much around me all night. No more language or anything, but the howls, hoots, imitating my holler thing, the woohoo. But it was uneventful other than that. And at this point, this is like second nature stuff. It happens all the time. And so I said a couple prayers for my dog and whatnot, and went home. And we changed, so we quit giving her dog food. And commercial dog food is just bad for dogs. There's a lot of fillers and chemicals and them things that give them cancer and tumors, and it's bad. So she was still eating and drinking, and we gave her a steak. And the next day she perked up a little bit, whether it be from the steak or prayers, I don't know. But so then we gave her some chicken and some rice and started feeding her people food. And within a day, she was back to, she has hip problems getting around, but she still walks and goes up and down. We walk her up and down the street. And she got back to where she was for the past 8 months or so, walking fine, going outside. And she totally turned around. So we were getting ready to go to Colorado elk hunting. And I had that hole open up the mountains and at the cabin. And I didn't want to leave that open to fill with water while we were going, and who knows how long it would be. So I went up there and I put a tarp over the hole, a big tarp, and that's like a 20 by 30 tarp. And so once I did that, I went down to where I heard the language a few days before behind the cabin. And I walked down there, and there's a big mossy old red oak there. It was about like a 2-inch carpet of moss on it. And there was a spot right where the voices were coming from, where the moss was picked off the top of the log in like maybe a 1.5 foot square area on top of the log. And there was moss on both sides of the log. And everything's covered in moss, the rocks, the boulders, a lot of the trees are deadfall that are rotting there. And right where that voices were coming from was a spot where it was picked down to the bare wood. And that's not from time to time hunting where a bear drags its belly over a mossy log, but that carpet of moss flops over to one side of the log where it drug on its belly. This was picked at, and there was almost like chunks of broccoli on both sides of the log. And so I jumped on the other side of the log, and I'm looking, and there was 3 footprints. You can see them so this was like 4 days had gone by since this happened. But I moved some leaves, and you can see the footprints. I can see 3 different footprints, and the one pretty good. You can see the depth of the impression in the soil, and the leaves were smashed. And you can actually see where when it went to take a step, and midway up the print, it heaved up a little bit. And so I have video and pictures of that. And I thought that was pretty amazing. And so then so my dog's doing better. And so we go to Colorado, and I've had things happen in Colorado. I went to Colorado elk hunting last year for the first time in my life, and I wish I'd have done it 30 years ago. And I had some things happen last year with vocalizations. And last year in Colorado was the first time and that's the only place I've ever heard whoops, where I go whoop, whoop. And that's the first place, or last year was the first time I ever heard that. So And I had some trees pushed over last year and different things. But we go hunting there. It was 3 weeks ago we were there. And so the first night I get there, and my son and his buddy, the season started on the 12th on a Saturday. So I got there on Wednesday. And we made base camp out of my transport trailer. And we set cots up in there. And then I got there right at dark on Wednesday. And I was setting an easy up behind the trailer for put tables up for kitchen and whatnot. And to cook on. And like we put 3 walls around it to enclose it from rain and wind. And so I'm pounding the tent stakes into the holes of the legs of the easy up and bang. And in the canyon, so our camp is basically on a hog's back, where there's a canyon on either side of us. And the canyon and the hog's back runs out back behind camp, probably 300 yards. And it peters out and rolls over into where 2 canyons come together. And so I'm beating the tent stakes into the easy up legs, and something in the canyon right next to me is almost imitating me. At first I thought it was another guy on the next ridge, maybe setting up a tent, because it was imitating me. It was like, man, it sounded like a hammer hitting tent stakes. And so I didn't think too much about it. And I finished staking the easy up down. And I walk over, and I just walked out a little bit to look over to the other ridge, and it was dark. It was pitch black, and there was nobody there. And it's, I don't know, 400 yards away, 300 yards away, but there was no one over. There was no lights I could see, and I could hear no other noises. And so I went about my business, setting up tables and stuff, getting ready. And I got everything else set up, and I had a fire going, and I'm sitting by the fire. And then in the canyon where the same tents the hammers were coming from, I hear rocks being banged together, and like rock clacks. And I never heard this before. This is the first time I ever heard this. It sounded like, and it wasn't a rhythm or a cadence to it. It was just random, like a bang and maybe a bang, bang. And it was just no rhythm, no nothing. But it sounded like somebody down there with 2 river rocks, banging 2 rocks together. So listened to that for a while, and then went to bed. Nothing happened. Went and picked Mark and his buddy up from the airport at Denver the next day at 2:00. Got back at dark, and elk hunted the next couple days. Got into some elk, couldn't get a shot. And so they wanted to go up into the wilderness area where it's foot travel. It's in a different unit. And so just to give you a general idea, we were in Western Colorado. We were north of Glenwood Springs, and there's I think it's the White River National Forest up above there, north of there. So we were up in there. So they wanted to go up into the unit above us and camp in the wilderness area out of a teepee tent with a wood burner and whatnot right on the ground. So I think we hunted around camp 2 days. So that would be Saturday. So Monday we headed up there, and they spotted elk. There's a deep gorge, and they spotted elk, a dozen elk on the other side of the gorge. But to get on the other side of the gorge, it's a 30-mile drive up around the head of the gorge and back the other side to get close to where these elk were. We drive up there on Monday, and we hunted in the morning. And then at midday, we set up the tent, and we found a decent spot to set up the tent and make a base camp for the teepee tent. And then we went off and hunted, tried to get close to where they glassed the elk from the other side of the gorge the day before. And like I said, when Mark glassed them, we were about 3 miles away from the elk across the gorge. Then we had to drive 30 miles around the head of the gorge to come down the other side. And so we went hunting. He actually, going into this dark timber to go over to this rock face to look into the basin, he booted a cow, and it was standing in the open, and he didn't realize it, but there was a big bull right behind her, but he couldn't see the bull because of the cedars behind it. And so he backed out and went back into the field and watched the edge of the field. He didn't want to blow them out of the timber and spook them anymore and save it for the next morning. So he backed out, and I was still out over a different rock face looking over this other basin. And so it was getting to be about dark, and I was just starting to make my way out. And they were close to the truck. a couple hundred yards away near the road. And he gets on the radio and calls me and says he hears, and I never heard this before. And he said they're right behind them across the road in the timber. They heard like Indian drums. And they said he said, just like if you're watching a cowboy movie and the war party's getting ready and they hear just Indian drums. And I said, I don't know. I said, he's asking me if it could be a moose or something. I was like, no, it ain't a moose. I was like, and he's explaining to me sounds just like Indian, somebody beating on drums. And I made my way out. Didn't hear the Indian drums, but we meet at the truck. We go back to the tent and we made some food, some of them ready-to-eat meals, and cleaning up. And his buddy was in the tent already, and me and my son were finishing up, and we hear the fake owl hoots coming towards us through the timber. And so the one was hooting, like a hoo, 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 hoo. And the other one was just a howl, almost like a howl, a cross between a hoot and a howl. And then there was a third one way off that was doing some vocalizations. So they came closer and closer, and when they come in, they stayed just in the timber line, just out of sight, and freaked us out because we're in the middle of nowhere. We're miles from anywhere. And like I said, when they say you're tagged, we're tagged because we have different encounters in different states, different places now around where we hunt at home. And so much has happened in the past 3 years or 4 years that it makes your hair stand on end, but in the back of your mind that nothing's going to happen. But there's always that, from listening to different people's encounters, there's always them ones out there that they're aggressive, and so you never know you're going to run into that. But, just about all our encounters are pretty much docile and just vocalizations and almost, hey, we're here kind of things. And that went on for, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes or so. And then you can hear them. They just, make their way off into the distance, and they were gone, and nothing else happened that night. And then, let's see. Yeah. So there was a couple other things at the end before we left, a couple of vocalizations at camp and stuff, but pretty much nothing else. So we head home, and on my way home, it takes 2 days to get home. My wife calls me and says that my dog had been doing pretty good for the last month, but she said she's not doing good again. And so we come home, and I ended up getting home Sunday morning at 4:00 in the morning. And when I got home, she wasn't doing good. She was just laying there, and we were trying to feed her laying there, and she was about done. So I hadn't slept in a while, and I got a couple hours of sleep. I got up again about 9:00 or whatever, and I was laid with her, and she ended up passing away about 2:00 in the afternoon. And I had to go and bury her up at the cabin. And so my son, we just came back from elk hunting, and he's in college, so he had some homework he had to get done. We were gone a week or so, and my wife didn't want to go, so I had to go up there alone and bury her. But obviously the hole was already dug. So I go up there and I back my truck in, and as soon as I opened the truck door, I knew they were there. The pressure, the quietness, I knew they were there. And I just asked them, I just said aloud, I said, this is tough enough. I says, please don't mess with me. And let me do what I got to do. So I uncovered a hole, and I buried her mostly by hand. And I finished it off with the backhoe. I had some rakes and shovels there, and I smoothed out the top. And so I put everything away, put the backhoe away. And this is probably 10:30 at night or so. And put everything away, rakes and shovels. So the last thing I had to put away was the tarp. And like I said, it's like a 20 by 30 foot tarp. And I keep it behind the cabin. There's like a 3-foot crawl space behind the cabin. And so I wasn't taking the time to fold it all up and everything. I just crumpled it up into a big giant 8-foot round ball and picked it up and went behind the cabin. And I'm stuffing this thing behind the cabin in that crawl space, and I'm jamming it in there, and I just get this overpowering feeling that something's right behind me staring at me. So I turn around, and my headlamp was dead. I had a flashlight in my pocket. I pull it out, and I turn around, and I didn't shine the light into the woods. It was on floodlight. It's a pretty bright light. And I just turned it on and pointed it at the ground in front of me and looked. And about 30 yards from me in the woods, between these two big red oaks, were these two giant gold eyes. And when I say they weren't yellow, they weren't owl eyes, they glistened. It was like if you took gold flakes, like 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch gold flake, and polished them and made eyeballs out of it. They glittered like you couldn't imagine. And they were huge. I'm going to say they were 3 inches in diameter, I'd say. They were huge. And this thing's 30 yards from me. So I didn't shine the light at it. And I'm shining a light in front of me, basically, but just the residual light casting off into the woods towards this thing. I can see the outline of it, but I can't see specific features other than the gold eyes. The gold eyes were huge, and it never blinked, and we're staring at each other. And it was extremely hairy. And it wasn't huge. So it was standing back behind the cabin. The property rolls off and goes over a hill into a drainage. So it was standing right where it starts to roll over the hill. So I'm thinking what I was seeing was from the waist up, or maybe the thighs up, because it didn't seem much bigger than me. And like I said, I'm 5'9". And even body size wise, the width of it seemed my size. And so I'm looking at it, and I'm not shining a light at it, but between us, I'm shining the light on the ground. And I'm looking at this thing and these big gold eyes, and I could see it was just covered in a lot of hair. And the hair on the head just rolled into the hair on the shoulders, and then it looked extremely hairy. And I could see the outline of the body. And so we're staring at each other, and I'm freaked out. When something like this, the adrenaline rush is just, it's phenomenal. It's just, all your hair stands on end. You get goosebumps. You can, even like at Halloween night when we had that encounter, when that thing threw that first boulder into the creek, when you get an adrenaline rush, yeah, you can see better. Your eyes are half open half the time. And when something like that happens, your eyeballs are wide open. You can smell better. You can see better. It's crazy. And I'm looking at this thing, and so I don't want to shine the light on it, but I want to see it a little better. So I clicked my light, because it was on like low power, which is still bright. And I clicked it to the high power, not shining at it. I didn't change the position of the light or where it was shining. But as soon as I clicked it onto a higher power, I could see it a little better. But the whole thing, it didn't just turn ahead. The whole body to turn to my right, its left. The eyes, I watched it. The whole thing turned to its left, my right, and went behind that oak tree, and it was gone. This thing's 30 yards from me. It was dry. It hadn't rained in a week. The leaves all just fell. There was no footfalls. There was no leaf crunching. There was no sticks breaking. Nothing. It turned, went behind that oak, and it was gone. It disappeared.
Wow.
So that freaked me out. And so that was, when did we get back? That was not even, was it a week ago? No, 2 weeks ago. Almost
Wow.
2 weeks ago.
Just 2 weeks ago. That is absolutely incredible. I need to have you on for a second episode just to break this apart, just to pretty much ask you questions.
I know.
This is wild.
5 years ago, I had my experiences in the 80s. And so that was my only visual. I had my experience in the 80s, and I was always in it's a physical being. But the things that's happened to me in the past, especially 3 years, the more experiences you have, the more questions you have, the deeper down the rabbit hole you go, you realize that they're not just a physical being, and they have these powers and abilities. And I didn't even get into the physical owl things and the experiences with that and the shape. Honestly, I know for a fact, I can't say what they do, but they shapeshift into owls, or they get, I know this is crazy. I know it sounds crazy, unbelievable. And I just had a sighting and you're crazy. I know, I was there 5 years ago, but they do shapeshift. They do either shapeshift into owls, crows, different animals, or they control them one way or another. And if you believe in God, you believe in spirits, and if you believe in, a lot of people believe in people being possessed, something evil getting into them and needing an exorcism or whatever. And they can believe in that, but they can't believe that a spiritual thing can be a Sasquatch, or can get into and control a owl or a crow or a deer. So how could you believe the evil part of it and not believe, say, like the good part of it? You know what I'm saying?
No, I totally get it. Would you be up for coming back for a second episode to further discuss this?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be great. I'm going to reach out to you to set up a time to come back on, because there's just so much. And I could ask you, I feel like I could ask you a question that would just really, this could get even more wild. But I would love to have you back on, Dave, so that we could really get further into this. And the stuff you've been sharing is incredible.
No problem.
I appreciate you coming on, and I will be reaching out to set up a second time to have you come back on, and we'll get further into it, sir. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good. I'll look forward to your message.
All right. Thank you, Dave.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremiah.
Please take a minute to help out the show by subscribing on YouTube, making sure you hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications, and share the episode on YouTube with a friend. Also, if you're listening to us on a podcast, thank you so much. Make sure that you're subscribed. Share the show with a friend. Really, it's all about sharing the show wherever you can. If you've had a Bigfoot encounter related to the following, or know someone who has, please reach out to me at bigfootsociety@gmail.com or pass on my email. Here's a list. If you've had any encounters in Oregon, which I'm sure there's probably a few of you out there, please feel free to reach out immediately. You can use email bigfootsociety@gmail.com. A special thank you to all the Bigfoot Society Patreon and YouTube channel members. It's your support that helps keep the show going, and I extremely appreciate it. If you want to join in the fun, you can join over at patreon.com/the Bigfoot Society. I'll see you there. And again, thanks for listening.